Sometimes a single dress can hold an entire lifetime. Every promise made, every word left unsaid. In a small American town, she was the bride who never walked down the aisle. The dress stayed, though, hanging in her closet like a memory that refused to fade. They said she was jilted, but the truth, the real truth, was something only she knew. If this story touches you, if you've ever held on to something long after it was gone, I invite you to subscribe to Voices of Auntie Donna, because here, every story is a heartbeat, and maybe, just maybe, the next one will sound like yours. There are things a woman keeps long after she should have let them go. A ribbon pressed in a Bible, a dried rose pinned inside a drawer, a letter never sent, and sometimes a dress. For Margaret Langley, the dress hung in the back of her closet like a ghost she didn't dare speak to. Ivory satin, soft as milk under lamplight, sleeves that brushed her wrists like a promise once made. Every spring she told herself she'd give it away. And every spring her hand trembled when she reached for it. It wasn't the kind of dress one forgets. It wasn't only the gown she was meant to be married in. It was the one she chose herself, in a little shop 2 towns over, long before she knew the truth. The truth that broke the wedding, the man, and her name all in a single afternoon. Back then, the town of Willow Creek sat quiet between 2 rivers and one long, dusty road. The people there lived simple, predictable lives. Church on Sundays, pie socials on Fridays, gossip every other day of the week. And Margaret? Well, she was meant to be one of those stories that ended neatly. She was 26, the eldest daughter of the Langley family, a name that meant decency and hard work. Her father ran the feed store. Her mother kept lace curtains spotless enough to shame the neighbors. Margaret taught piano lessons to the children in town and sang hymns at the Methodist church. She was steady, calm, the kind of woman people trusted to pour coffee and keep secrets. And then there was Charles Alden. Charles came to Willow Creek in 41, tall and certain, with the kind of smile that made mothers suspicious and daughters blush. He'd returned from the war early, his uniform pressed, his voice low, his eyes carrying something unsaid. The Alden farm had been failing for years before he inherited it, but within months there were new fences, new horses, and new talk in town. Charles Alden was fixing things. When he asked Margaret to marry him the following summer, the church bells themselves seemed to ring in approval. Her mother wept. Her father nodded. The whole town began to prepare for the wedding before she even said yes, but she did. Of course she did. She remembered the fitting, how the dressmaker pinned the lace just under her collarbone, how her mother had fussed with the veil, how her little sister Lila had giggled, whispering, "You look like an angel, Maggie." It was June, and the air smelled of honeysuckle and dust. Her life was set, or so she thought. But then came the letter. It arrived 3 days before the wedding. No name, no return address, just a cream envelope tucked between the day's milk bill and the church program. Inside, a few words written in a slanted, trembling hand. "He promised me too. Ask him about the ring." Margaret read it twice, then a third time, until the letters blurred. She tried to laugh, to tell herself it was some cruel trick, some jealous woman stirring up small-town spite. But that night, when Charles came by for supper, she saw it. The way his eyes flickered when she mentioned the post, the hesitation before he said her name. And suddenly, she knew. She didn't ask him about the ring. She didn't confront him. She simply nodded through the meal, smiled when her mother spoke of honeymoon trains and painted cottages, and let the night pass like a scene she'd already watched once before. By morning, the church was decorated, the guests arriving, and the bells waiting, and Margaret Langley, the bride everyone adored, slipped out the back door and never came. They said she'd been jilted, that Charles had left her standing there, veil in hand, that her father had nearly struck him, that her mother fainted, that the town whispered for months. Margaret never corrected them, maybe because it was easier that way. Maybe because pride has its own quiet dignity, even when the truth aches to be told. She left Willow Creek for a time, went to stay with an aunt in Georgia, learned to keep her chin high when strangers asked questions. She wrote letters she never sent, played piano for children who'd never know her story, and told herself she'd stopped caring. But grief has a scent. It lingers, like the faint perfume on the hem of a dress. And when she returned home a year later, after her father's illness, after her mother's pleading letters, she unpacked her things, hung her dresses, and at the very back, behind all the rest, she placed it, the wedding gown, still pressed, still waiting. Every so often she'd see Charles in town. He'd tip his hat, polite as ever, carrying on with the ease of a man who'd rewritten his own history. People still pitied her. Poor Margaret, still alone, but their voices no longer stung. Because over time her heart had learned something powerful, that silence can be a shield. Years passed. Seasons turned. The satin yellowed a little at the edges, and one morning, as Margaret stood by the window with her tea, she heard the sound of a car rolling up the drive, unfamiliar, steady. When she stepped out onto the porch, the man standing there wore the same eyes, the same quiet guilt. Charles Alden had come back, and in his hand he held a small box wrapped in faded ribbon. The box he brought back when Margaret first saw Charles standing at the edge of her porch, the years between them folded like pages of an old letter, yellowed, but still legible. The wind lifted the hem of her housecoat, and the scent of lilacs drifted through the air, the same lilacs that once bloomed beside the church the day she didn't marry him. He hadn't changed much. His hair had thinned a little, his jaw a touch softer, but his eyes, gray as rain-soaked gravel, held that same restless searching. He stood with his hat in hand, like a boy asking to come inside after curfew. She didn't invite him in. Not right away. Instead, she leaned against the doorframe, her teacup cooling in her hand. "Morning, Mr. Alden," she said finally. "You're far from your side of town." The formality was deliberate. She wanted distance, but the sound of his voice, low, worn, almost apologetic, pierced through years of careful calm. "I won't stay long," he said. "Just came to bring this." He lifted the small box between them, wrapped in a faded blue ribbon. The kind of ribbon used for letters once tied, once cherished. The kind of thing that carried more weight than it appeared to. Margaret hesitated. She could have refused it, could have turned away, closed the door, and pretended the past had never knocked. But something in the way he held it, not like a gift, but a burden, made her pause. She reached out. Their fingers brushed. And in that small, unsteady moment, the years dissolved. She set the box on the table inside, beside the window where the lace curtain fluttered. Charles remained on the porch, his boots tracing the same patch of wood he'd once stood on when he'd asked her father for her hand. Margaret didn't open the box right away. Instead, she stared at it, the corners softened by time, the ribbon worn thin at the edges. "It belonged to you," he said quietly, as though answering the question she hadn't asked. "Found it in my mother's trunk after she passed. Said it was meant for you, though it never reached your hands." The air felt heavier now. Margaret remembered Mrs. Alden, a stern, sharp-eyed woman who had never approved of her, who'd once told her in the churchyard, "A woman like you marries for duty, not for dreams." She had dismissed it then, as small-town jealousy. But now she wasn't sure. She untied the ribbon. Inside was a letter, folded in careful halves, and beneath it, a gold ring with a small sapphire stone, the same one that had once been meant for her finger. The sight of it made her throat tighten. The handwriting on the letter was unmistakably his. Younger, bolder, the kind of penmanship that belonged to a man who still believed he controlled his future. "Margaret," it began, "if you find this, it means I've done the wrong thing for what I thought were the right reasons." Her hand trembled. She stopped reading, unable, or perhaps unwilling, to go further. Outside, Charles spoke again, his voice low. "I don't expect forgiveness. Just thought you had the right to know. It wasn't what it looked like." Margaret laughed, softly, bitterly. The kind of laugh that sounds more like breaking glass. "You think I waited all these years wondering what it looked like?" she said. "People forget, Charles. The world moves on." But the lie sat heavy in her chest, because the truth was, she hadn't forgotten. Not the letter. Not the church bells. Not the way her mother had looked at her with a mix of pity and pride. "You didn't have to let them think I left you," he said suddenly. "You could have told them. Could have told the whole town." Margaret turned toward him then, her voice quiet but steady. "I could have," she said. "But pride keeps its own company, Charles. And sometimes, that's all a woman has." For a long time, neither spoke. The air between them hummed with the ghosts of words left unsaid. Finally, she placed the ring back inside the box, retied the ribbon, and handed it back to him. "Whatever. This was meant to fix," she said softly. "It's too late now." He took it, but didn't move. His hand lingered on the rail, knuckles pale. "Margaret," he said, "there's something else. Something I need you to know. I didn't just come for the ring." Her pulse quickened. The way he said it, slow, careful, carried the weight of confession. "I came because—" He hesitated, his gaze flickering toward the road. "Because she's gone." Margaret frowned. "Who?" "Evelyn." The name hit her like a chill down the spine. Evelyn Price. The girl everyone whispered about that summer. The girl who'd left town with a bad reputation and a broken heart. The girl who'd written that letter. "She died last spring," he said quietly. "Consumption, out in Kansas. I found her things when I went to settle her affairs. And there were letters, Margaret. Letters with your name." Her breath caught. That night, after he left, Margaret sat alone in the kitchen, the letter unfolded once more before her. Outside, crickets sang in the tall grass, the same rhythm they'd hummed the night before her wedding, the one that never happened. She read his words again, slower this time. "I didn't love her, not the way I love you, but I made a promise to her family before the war. One I couldn't undo without shame. I thought I could fix it quietly. I was wrong." Tears welled, hot and reluctant. She pressed the paper against her chest, as though holding back time itself. For years, she had built her dignity on silence. Let the town believe what it wanted. But now, holding his letter, she realized something cruel. The truth hadn't vanished. It had simply been waiting, patient, like the dress in her closet. She rose, went to her bedroom, and opened the wardrobe door. The dress still hung there. Ivory faded to cream, veil folded at its hem, the faint scent of lavender still clinging to it. Her reflection in the mirror caught her by surprise. Older, yes, wiser too. But behind her eyes, something fragile stirred. It wasn't regret. It was recognition. The story wasn't finished. Not yet. The letters. She was never meant to read morning crept softly through the lace curtains, painting thin lines of gold across the wooden floor. Margaret hadn't slept. The letter, his letter, lay open beside her cup of untouched tea. Outside, a fog rolled low over Willow Creek, blurring the fence posts, making the world look half-remembered. She felt the ache of something stirring, something she thought she had long buried. Not love exactly, but the echo of it, haunting as a hymn left unfinished. Charles's words replayed in her mind. "There were letters, Margaret. Letters with your name." She told herself she didn't care. Told herself that the past had already had its say, but pride and curiosity are close cousins. By afternoon, she found herself walking the path toward the Alden farm, the same path she'd once dreamed of walking as a bride. The Alden house stood quiet now. Its shutters faded, the barn half collapsed from years of neglect. The The scent of old hay and damp earth hung in the air, familiar and distant all at once. Charles met her at the door, as though he had been expecting her. He didn't smile this time, only stepped aside, letting her in without a word. The parlor was the same, though dimmer. A portrait of his mother still hung above the mantel, her eyes sharp even in oil paint, as if judging from beyond. On the table lay a small stack of letters tied with string. Evelyn's handwriting was unmistakable, rounded, young, and full of the kind of longing that made your heart ache even before you read the words. Charles gestured toward them. "They're yours," he said quietly. "Or, they were meant for you." Margaret hesitated before touching them. The paper was fragile, edges browned by time. Each envelope bore her name, Miss Margaret Langley, though none had ever reached her hand. "My mother," he said softly. She intercepted them, thought she was protecting me, or perhaps protecting herself. The air seemed to tighten around them. Margaret traced the ink with her fingertip, her throat dry. She sat, and with a steadying breath, opened the first. "Dear Margaret, you don't know me, but you know the man I once loved. I was foolish once, thinking promises could be rewritten. He never spoke of you cruelly, only with sorrow. But I thought you deserved to know that his heart was not entirely free. I never meant to ruin anything. I only wanted peace." Margaret stopped reading. The words were softer than she expected. Not bitter, not jealous, only wounded. She unfolded another. "He still keeps your photograph. I see it when he thinks I'm not looking. I've tried to hate you, but I can't. Maybe I envy the kind of woman you must be, to be loved like that." A third letter. The ink faded almost to gray. "If this doesn't reach you, then perhaps it's better that way. Some truths only bring more pain. I'll be leaving soon. West, maybe Kansas. Tell him I forgive him if he ever lets you read this." Margaret's hands trembled. The paper crackled softly, the sound like dry leaves. She realized with a slow and aching clarity that Evelyn hadn't been the villain of her story. She had been another woman caught in the same net. Two hearts tangled in one man's silence. Charles watched her quietly, the lines around his mouth deepening. "She sent them all that summer," he said. "I didn't know. Mother kept them in her bureau, said you'd moved on. I found them only after she passed." Margaret placed the letters down gently. "You could have brought them sooner," she whispered. "I wasn't sure you'd want to read them." "You're right," she said, rising from her chair. "I don't know that I did." Her voice cracked, but she steadied it, years of composure holding her upright. She turned toward the window, the light shifting across her face. Dust danced in the air like the remnants of old dreams. "You loved her?" she asked softly. He hesitated. "In a way. But not the way she needed. And not the way I loved you. It should have felt like redemption. But instead, it felt like sorrow wearing truth's disguise." Margaret left before sunset. The letters she carried with her pressed against her chest like fragile bones. The road home was long, the sky streaked with the pale lavender of evening. The air hummed with crickets and the memory of promises broken. When she reached her gate, she paused, looking toward her house, the light spilling through the parlor window, the shadow of the dress still visible through the half-closed closet door. Inside, she lit a lamp, laid the letters out in order, and read them all again, slower this time. Each one peeled back another layer of her story, until she saw it clearly. Not as the world had told it, but as it truly was. She wasn't the woman who'd been left. She was the woman who had walked away, not from love, but from lies. That night, she did something she hadn't done in years. She pulled the wedding dress from its hanger and draped it across her bed. The satin shimmered faintly in the lamplight, whispering of what might have been. Then, she folded the letters and placed them atop the gown, like closing a book she finally understood. For the first time in a long while, she slept deeply. But peace has a way of arriving just before the next storm. Because 2 weeks later, a stranger came to Willow Creek, a girl with eyes the color of Charles's, carrying a letter of her own, one that would unravel everything Margaret thought she'd mended. The girl from Kansas, the summer sun lay thick over Willow Creek the day the girl arrived. That kind of slow, honeyed heat that makes the air shimmer and the world feel half asleep. Margaret was tending to her hydrangeas by the porch when she heard the rattle of a motor car on the gravel road. Few cars came that far down, and none ever stopped at her gate. But this one did. A cloud of dust rose behind it, drifting lazily as the engine sputtered to silence. The car door opened and out stepped a girl, maybe 19, 20 at most. Her dress was simple, cotton blue faded from travel, a straw hat clutched nervously in her hand. She stood still for a moment, squinting toward the porch as though gathering her courage. "Mrs. Langley?" she called softly, her voice edged with the sweetness of the Midwest, a Kansas kind of softness, where words fall slow and careful. Margaret straightened, brushing soil from her gloves. "Miss Langley," she corrected automatically. "And you are?" The girl hesitated, fingers tightening around the hat brim. "My name's Anna," she said. "Anna Price." The name hit like a quiet chord struck too hard. Price. Margaret's breath caught. Evelyn's name had been Price. She invited the girl onto the porch, partly out of politeness, partly out of instinct. There was something fragile about her, something that made you want to speak gently. Up close, Margaret could see the resemblance, the same light hair, the same shape of eyes that Evelyn had in the photographs from old church fairs. But there was something else too, a shadow of someone else she knew. Charles. The girl smiled, faintly, nervously. "You don't know me, ma'am. But my mama did. Or she said she did. She told me your name before she passed." Margaret's heart thudded. "Your mother?" she murmured. "Evelyn." The girl nodded. She talked about Willow Creek sometimes, like it was a dream she left behind. Said there was a woman here who once saved her from becoming bitter. I think she meant you. Margaret didn't know what to say. The words felt like pebbles in her mouth, awkward, heavy, unsteady. She motioned toward the chair. "Sit, child." "You've come a long way." The girl sat, smoothing her skirt with both hands. Her eyes wandered toward the open window, where the faint gleam of ivory fabric was visible through the half-drawn curtain. "That's a pretty dress," she said softly. Margaret followed her gaze. "It was meant for a wedding," she said, her tone careful. But life had other plans. Anna smiled in that way young people do, when they sense a story older than they are. Mama used to say life's best stories start with what didn't happen. They sat for a while, listening to the crickets in the heat. Finally, the girl reached into her handbag and pulled out an envelope. The paper was wrinkled, the ink faded but legible. "I was told to bring this to you," she said. "Mama wrote it before she passed. Said you'd know what to do with it." Margaret's fingers trembled slightly as she took it. The name on the front, Margaret Langley, written in the same delicate hand she'd seen on the earlier letters. She hesitated, staring at the seal. The last time she'd opened one, it had changed everything. She looked up at Anna, who watched her with quiet anticipation. "Do you know what it says?" Margaret asked. The girl shook her head. "No, ma'am. She never told me. Just said it was for the woman she once wronged and never stopped thinking about." The wind shifted, lifting a strand of the girl's hair, brushing it against her cheek. For a moment, the past and present overlapped, the ghost of the woman and the daughter she left behind. Margaret drew in a breath and broke the seal. "Dear Margaret, if you're reading this, it means I've run out of time to say what I should have years ago. There are things I need to set right, not for me, but for her. For Anna. She's his daughter, Margaret. Charles's. I never told him, and perhaps that was my final sin. I couldn't bear to bring her back here, to the place where everything fell apart, but I raised her with your name on my lips, not as blame, but as grace." The words blurred. Margaret felt the porch tilt slightly beneath her feet. Charles's daughter, the girl, Evelyn's child, was his blood. Anna sat quietly, hands folded in her lap, unaware of the storm behind Margaret's eyes. "If she ever finds her way to you," the letter continued, "please don't turn her away. Tell her about him if you can. Tell her he was good once, even if he failed us both. tell her, I forgave you long before I learned to forgive myself. The last line was smeared, as if written through tears. Margaret folded the letter carefully, pressing it against her chest. For a long while, she said nothing. The sky had turned amber by the time Charles's car appeared again at the end of the road. He stepped out, uncertain, his hat in his hands as always. When his eyes fell on Anna, he froze. She turned to look at him, and in that single moment, Margaret saw it, recognition, something wordless, undeniable. Anna rose from her chair, uncertain. You must be Mr. Alden, she said softly. Charles swallowed hard. Yes, he whispered. I suppose I am, and Margaret, standing between them, felt the weight of everything unspoken, the past she'd once fled, now standing before her in the shape of a young woman who carried both their ghosts. That night, after they'd gone, after the introductions and the tears and the awkward, hesitant promises, Margaret stood in her doorway, watching the last light fade. The letter still rested in her hand. The dress still hung in her closet, but something in her heart had shifted. For years, she had believed the dress symbolized what she lost. Now she began to wonder if it was what she had been spared. And as the cicadas hummed and the stars blinked awake above the fields, she whispered to the night, almost as a prayer, let this be the start of something truer than what came before. The blood between them, it was strange, Margaret thought, how the sound of voices could change the air in a house. For years, her home had known only quiet, the soft scrape of a chair, the ticking of the clock, the faint hum of a woman who'd learned to live with her own company. But now, there was laughter. Soft, uncertain, like someone testing a forgotten melody. From the kitchen, she could hear Anna and Charles talking. The girl's voice was bright, curious. His lower, careful. A man learning to speak gently around what might break him. Margaret stood in the doorway, unseen for a moment, watching the two of them over the rim of her teacup. Charles sat with his elbows on the table, hat set aside, his hair disheveled from running a nervous hand through it. Anna leaned forward, listening intently as he spoke about the farm, the horses, the old apple orchard, the summers that used to hum with bees and hard work. He was trying, Margaret realized, trying to fill the space that years had left empty. But there was a hesitation in Anna's eyes, a faint question that trembled just behind her smile. Finally, she asked it. Did you know about me? The silence that followed was heavy, almost sacred. Charles's shoulders stiffened. His eyes lowered. No, he said quietly. I didn't, not until your mother passed. I should have guessed, but I didn't. Anna nodded, though her lips pressed tight. Mama always said you weren't a cruel man, just a scared one. The word struck something deep in him. He looked up. And for the first time in years, Margaret saw that same flicker of shame she'd seen on the day he'd stood on her porch with the blue-ribboned box. She was right, he said softly. I was scared of what people would think, of the truth catching up to me. Margaret stepped forward then, letting the chair leg scrape gently against the floor, a small, deliberate sound that pulled their attention toward her. And now it has, she said. Charles looked at her, weary but grateful for the honesty. Yes, he murmured. Now it has. They ate together that evening, the three of them, as if sharing a meal could somehow soften what history had hardened. The table between them was the same oak her father had built, scarred by years of suppers and seasons. Anna asked questions about Willow Creek, about the schoolhouse, the fairs, the river that everyone said glowed pink at sunset. Charles answered in quiet tones, but Margaret noticed how his hands trembled when he lifted his glass. When Anna excused herself after supper, saying she needed to write a letter back home, the silence that followed between Margaret and Charles wasn't hostile, just tired. She's a good girl, Margaret said at last. She is, he replied. More her mother's heart than mine. And yet she came looking for you, he sighed. That's what frightens me. Margaret turned toward him, brow furrowed. Why? Because she deserves better than a man made of mistakes. The words lingered in the air. Margaret looked down at her hands, remembering the years she'd once spent wondering if he'd ever regretted her. Now, watching him wrestle with his own guilt, she felt something shift inside her, something that wasn't quite forgiveness, but not resentment either. "You can't undo the past, Charles," she said softly, "but you can stop hiding from it." Later that night, Margaret found Anna sitting by the porch steps, writing by lamplight. The crickets sang loud in the tall grass, and the sky had turned that deep violet blue that feels almost holy. Margaret sat beside her, the boards creaking gently. "Who are you writing to?" "My aunt back in Kansas," Anna said. "She'll worry if I don't write." "You must have loved your mother dearly." The girl smiled faintly. "I did. She was strong, but sad too. Some nights she'd sit by the window and hum, always the same tune. I never knew what it was, but it sounded like goodbye." Margaret's throat tightened. She knew that tune. She'd played it once on her piano, the night before the wedding that never was. Evelyn must have heard it, must have carried it with her across all those lonely years. "Your mother and I," Margaret began carefully. "We were two sides of the same story, both believing we were the one who'd lost." Anna looked at her, eyes glimmering in the lamplight. "And were you?" Margaret smiled, though it didn't quite reach her eyes. Maybe not. Sometimes losing a man isn't a tragedy. It's a mercy written in disguise. When the girl went to bed, Margaret stood by the window for a long while, staring toward the Alden farm in the distance. The moonlight spilled over the fields like milk, soft and pale. She thought of the dress hanging behind her, the one she couldn't bring herself to part with. It had once meant forever. Now it meant freedom. And yet, as she turned to draw the curtains, she saw a figure in the distance. Charles, standing at the end of the road, his face tilted toward her window. He didn't wave. Didn't move. Just stood there, as if trying to say all the things time had stolen. The next morning, Margaret found a note on the porch, folded, tucked beneath the flower pot. "Margaret, I'm leaving for a few days. Need to see to the farm. But before I go, I want to thank you for what you've done. For her, for me. You didn't have to open your door, but you did. I've carried guilt for too long. And maybe that's my punishment. But seeing her, it makes me want to live better than I've been living. I'll return soon. I hope by then you'll still open the door. It wasn't signed. It didn't need to be." Margaret folded the note, pressed it to her lips, and then slipped it into the pocket of her apron, where it rested, warm against her heart. She didn't know if it was hope or foolishness that made her smile. Perhaps both. The fire on the hill. There are moments when life tests the things we've buried, when all the careful silence, all the dignity, all the years spent holding one's head high, are suddenly set against something raw and real. For Margaret, that test came with smoke. It began as a faint smell one evening, something sharp and wrong threading through the summer air. The town's hills had been dry that year, the grass brittle, the soil cracked from weeks without rain. By the time she stepped out onto her porch, the sky to the west was already the color of rust. She heard the church bell first, not its Sunday voice, but the frantic tolling that meant danger. Then came the shouts, carried faintly on the wind. The Alden farm, the barn, fire, her breath caught. Charles. The world turned to motion then, fast, chaotic. Anna came running from the yard, clutching her shawl. "It's the hill, Aunt Margaret. It's burning." Margaret didn't think. She simply moved, grabbed the pail, the blanket, her boots, her resolve. The road was already filling with people, neighbors, farmers, children wide-eyed at the orange glow rising over the ridge. By the time she reached the edge of the Alden property, the flames were climbing high, clawing at the night sky like hungry hands. The barn was half gone. The horses were screaming. And in the midst of it, Charles. He was trying to cut one of the ropes holding the last stall door closed. His sleeve was scorched, his face blackened with soot. "Charles!" He turned, startled, and in that instant the roof groaned. A beam fell, sending sparks into the air like a cruel constellation. Margaret didn't remember running toward him. only the weight of her skirts catching firelight, the sting of heat on her skin, the single thought that pulsed through her like a heartbeat. Not again. I won't lose him again. By the time they dragged the last bucket from the well, the barn was little more than a smoldering skeleton against the stars. The fire had spared the house, but not much else. The orchard, the fences, gone. Margaret sat on the grass, her hands trembling, watching as Charles poured water over the last embers. He was coughing, his voice ragged. Anna pressed a damp cloth to his arm, tears streaking her soot-stained face. "You could have died," she whispered. He gave a faint, crooked smile. "Would have served me right." Margaret turned sharply toward him. "Don't you dare say that." He looked up, and in the firelight, she saw it. Not pride, not pity, just exhaustion. A man who'd carried too many ghosts for too long. "Maybe I don't know how to live without guilt anymore," he said softly. Margaret stood, her shadow stretching long behind her. "Then maybe it's time you learn." They walked home in silence that night. The stars had dimmed beneath the haze of smoke. Anna walked ahead, clutching her shawl tight around her shoulders. Charles walked beside Margaret, though he limped slightly, his hand brushing hers once, then retreating, as if afraid of what the touch might mean. At her gate, he stopped. "You saved my life tonight," he said. "You've done the same for me," she replied. "When?" "When you left." He looked at her, startled. "If you hadn't, I might have never learned who I was without you." The night held its breath. Neither spoke again, but as he turned to go, she reached out, just for a second, and rested her hand on his arm. "Charles," she said quietly, "come back when you're ready to stop running from what's already forgiven." The fire took days to fully die out, but its echo lingered longer, in the smell of smoke that clung to their clothes, in the blackened ridge that now cut across the hill like a scar. The town whispered about it, of course. They always did. Some said it was lightning, others said it was carelessness. A few murmured that maybe it was fate, burning away what was never meant to last. Margaret didn't argue. She just opened her windows wide, let the smoke drift through her house like a memory being aired out. One morning, she found Anna on the porch steps, sketching the hill. The girl's pencil was light, deliberate, turning loss into something beautiful. "He's rebuilding," Anna said. "The neighbors are helping. He said he's not leaving town again." Margaret smiled faintly. Maybe the fire was his reckoning. Anna looked at her. "And yours?" Margaret gazed toward the horizon, where the sky had softened into the gentle pink of dawn. "Mine began long before his. But maybe this is where it ends." That evening, alone in her room, Margaret opened the closet. The dress still hung there. Ivory turned to cream, lace yellowed at the edges. She touched the fabric lightly, feeling its fragile weight against her fingers. There had been a time she'd believed this dress was meant to be worn walking down an aisle. Now she thought maybe it was meant to teach her that love can survive, even when promises do not. She folded it carefully, laid it across the bed, and for the first time in 2 decades, whispered a prayer. Not for what might have been, but for what still could be. I hope you enjoyed the video. The next part will be uploaded very soon. Thank you for watching Voices of Auntie Donna. Don't forget to subscribe and share it with your friends.